I thought when I was driving up here what I'd say, and the first thing is probably what I'd like you to remember the most, and that is that any journalist should be humble. We should be humble before the events we cover. We should be humble before the people who share with us what they know and feel. We should be humble before the corrosive power of our mistakes. This award makes you feel especially humility when you look at the names on the list and you look back through the tradition of who stood in some place like this room here on the campus, looking at a crowd of people who probably should have the award and not me. When you read the names on that long list and you tremble a little, you're reminded that all journalists should be humble. I was asked to talk a little bit about a war we didn't mention, that you didn't mention, but that we're reading each day, and that's Syria. What's it like to work in Syria? I think everyone who does would give you a similar answer, which is that every war has its perils, and Syria presents more than most. I'm going to go back next Tuesday. I'll leave, and I'll connect with the photographer I work with the most over the years, Tyler Hicks, and then a few days after that, we'll probably cross in again for a little while. Syria is different than a lot of places we work because the government forbids us from going in, so we have to go in illegally. Many of the rebels are suspicious of us as outsiders, probably for good reason. The access is limited, but not just socially. It's also exceptionally dangerous because it's so fluid, because there are so many military and paramilitary units, military units that are morphing into militias, militias that are morphing into proxies for the military, that you often don't know what you're facing down a given road. And to that, I would say that's all the more reason to go. The place so dissuades our presence that it's one of the few wars where we're not thick. A lot of times you go to a war, and Finbar and I had this experience last year, and on the main roads where the war is happening, there's a crowd of us, sometimes 6, sometimes 10, sometimes 60 of us all basically doing the same thing. And if you take any one of us out from that, probably wouldn't much matter because there's someone else there to cover it. But there's a lot of places and a lot of wars and a lot of seams in wars where there's no one or very few of us. Syria is one of those places. And so the stories that carry some of these risks, have some of these hassles or even dangers, they often demand more of our attention because the words and the pictures and the video coming out are fewer. And that leads to the real subject tonight, which is about those words that come out and the pictures and the video through social media. Wars have changed a lot in terms of how you cover them in the last 10 years. When we look at what we do today and what we did 10 years ago, we do many of the same things and we do a whole host of new things. And we're doing these new things because of changes in technology. I'm carrying a camera everywhere I go now. It started out as a visual notebook. I could pop a picture of someone I was interviewing, and it was faster than writing down a description of him or her, and I could just look at the picture later. So it created efficiencies. I started to use a video camera, small one, in that little handheld camera, usually about the size of a pack of cigarettes. I started to use a video camera the same way you use a digital tape recorder to gather a transcript. But this was a visual transcript as well as an audio transcript. Gradually, as we figured out how to use these tools, we started incorporating them frontally into our work, publishing a few pictures, working with competent producers, one of whom I am not, to weave video footage that we take out of wars by the brick into a coherent few minutes. All of this, as I just described it, is happening in the traditional sphere, with editorial supervision, with a bank of colleagues, with a code of ethics, in circumstances that aren't any different than what I just used to write straight print stories was all about. All of these things are also happening simultaneously all around us every day at a speed and in a volume that's almost impossible to track through social media. But is it journalism? I'm not convinced it is. It certainly is information. Some of it passes for journalism. Perhaps some of it is, but a lot of it's not. I'm going to give you an example of using social media in a way that was journalism, and it allowed me to do something that 5 years ago, certainly 10, I never could have done. Last year, a group of us went into a port in Libya that was under siege. And after being there not very long, the port was struck by a type of munition that had never been used before. The Gaddafi forces fired it into the city. I looked at some of the remnants and the unexploded pieces. I knew what they were roughly, kind of the way, you know, a bird's a bird, but you might not know what type. We knew they were cluster munitions, but they didn't match any cluster munitions that had ever been used in combat before. I'm not a bank of information. I can make a call like that, but how do I figure out what they are and who sold them to Gaddafi? So we took pictures, Brian Denton and I, and we put the pictures not just in the queue of photographs at the New York Times via email or FTP. I put them in the email inbox of a friend of mine who happens to be an explosive ordnance disposal tech. He took a look at them and said, I don't know what they are, even though it's my job to. I've never seen them before. Mind if I put them on Facebook? He put them on Facebook, and immediately a clutch of his friends all around the world had something like a meeting. And over the course of less than an hour, one of them, I don't know which one, I have some suspicions, went into one of the pubs that you're not supposed to go into, I think, and figured out what it was. And the answer came back. The cost to my friend, I'm told, was a beer. And he told me that these were Spanish submunitions, who had made them, roughly what year, roughly what factory. And it told us that Spain was dealing weapons with Gaddafi after it had, in principle, agreed to join the Convention Against Cluster Munitions. It had offloaded some of its stock to a dictator who then fired him into one of his own cities. This would be news. It would never have made news, or certainly would not have made news at anything like that speed. This happened overnight, if it weren't for social media. Social media is an incredible tool, but it's also not, in some ways, much different than the telephone was when it first came along. People probably said, wow, you have a telephone, that really changes your job. Is it still journalism if you got it over the phone? You know? The same thing with Twitter. The same thing with Pinterest, or I have a Tumblr. All of these are just other conduits of information. They happen to be places where people can meet quickly. But it's just a meeting, whether it's on Facebook or whether you're having it in a room like this. So let's talk about the social media piece that we call citizen journalism. Like I said, some of it's really journalism. But if you look at it every day, remember those traditional things I talked about? A bank of colleagues, a code of ethics, a group of editors or producers? That doesn't exist on social media when it's so-called citizen journalism. Now, in some ways, that can be a beautiful thing. It increases speed. It increases the volume. Sometimes it takes away filters that you wouldn't want there. Filters of race or gender or nationalism, all sorts of things that might, in a given institution, Western or otherwise, influence how a report is shaped, might not be there when it's just one person. But by removing that, you might call it a filter, you might call it a process, but by removing the bank of colleagues, the code of ethics, the producers, the editors, you get things like false reports of chemical attacks at a huge rate every day coming out of Syria. I probably sifted through 7 or 8 of them today. We sifted through them in Libya last year. One day, one of them may be right, but we're crying wolf on social media constantly, loudly, 24 hours a day. You get things like motivations that affect a report in such a way that the report is outright false. I'll give you an example. Tomorrow, if a plane is shot down, like a plane was shot down yesterday in Syria, you probably will see, if the pattern holds, multiple people make videos claiming responsibility for downing that plane. You might get 3, you might get 4, you might get 10 different people, different groups will claim that they shot down the plane. If you are watching social media, or if you've got a lot of people you know who watch social media and then send you emails, which is what happens to a lot of us dinosaurs, you could be tempted to say that the first gentleman holding up the Stinger-type missile, an SA-7 or an SA-16, actually shot down the plane because he said he did. But there's a lot of motivations in a report like that, including if I can get you to believe that I shot down that plane, I might also get you to believe that you should give me some money from your bank account in Dubai. And so you have all sorts of pieces on social media that are talked about as if they're journalism, but they're not journalists at all. It's a fundraising document, or it's a piece of propaganda. You also find in a lot of these reports a hesitation to report bad news, because some of these reports are so partisan in their nature, so linked to a given side, that if, for example, a Libyan fighting cell is working its way down the road to Brega, and they stop 10 miles short of Brega and take a look and decide, today we're going to attack Brega, but we're not going to attack in the traditional sense that we're actually going to try to enter Brega. We're going to pull up to the range of the rockets on the back of my truck, and we're going to just fire them into Brega. And where they come down, other than at Brega, isn't really our business. That's called an indiscriminate attack. We saw them virtually every day in Libya. We reported them virtually every day in Libya. That's our job. Social media didn't touch it. Didn't exist. Social media attacked us for reporting it because this is a democratic uprising, right? The end either justifies the means, or the truth is something we can challenge. You'll see this same thing in in Syria. You'll see it each day, that the bad news, the indiscriminate fire, the sectarian and ethnic violence, the looting, it won't make the story on citizen journalism. It will make the story in traditional journalism. It will be the story in traditional journalism. I'll give you another example. If you, on a given day earlier this spring, was watching some of the citizen journalism reports, you would see the declaration of a new special forces fighting group among the Syrian rebels, and they were all holding up a particular type of submachine gun. And the internet lit up briefly. Wow, someone's given them new arms. And boy, don't they look competent and menacing. This is a turning point in the war. If you looked closely, and a British arms researcher did, and then shared it with a traditional media outlet, those guns were toys. You could buy them for $5.95 on Amazon. But it looked pretty convincing. So what is all this stuff we call citizen journalism? And what is the role of social media in it? Social media is like a telephone. It's just a telephone with a lot of lights on it, so you can get a bunch of people on it at once. And citizen journalism is information. Some of it rises to the standard of journalism. Most of it doesn't. It's a huge amount of information, and we welcome it. And it's changed the nature of my job. When I'm in the States now, I probably spend an hour or two every single day going through the social media presentations of the Syrian war. And it's immensely instructive and useful, but it needs a filter. It needs an editor. If it has an editor, it can be valuable. And we have insights from afar into wars now that were impossible 2, 3, 4 years ago. And this will only continue to develop. There'll only be more of it. And my argument is, as there gets to be more of it, it becomes so overwhelming, probably already is, that you need Reuters all the more. And you need the Washington Post all the more. And you need CNN all the more, or BBC. You need someone who can process it, who can turn it into journalism, who can incorporate it, just like a phone call, just like an interview, who can incorporate it into journalism. it gives us content, and it points us in new directions. And so it's valuable, the citizen journalism, the social media. It challenges us not to be lazy. It's a spur. It's a great critic. Get something wrong, get something not quite complete as it obviously should be, and you're going to get pounded on social media fast. That's valuable. That's great. Every time you try to write a story, all you see is goalies, you know, everywhere. That's immensely valuable. To me, that's probably more valuable than a lot of the content. And to me, that tells us sort of the counterintuitive lesson, which is more people are reading us than ever before. We may have fewer consumers. People might not be paying for it. But judging by anything I write, the volume of feedback that it creates to me, a lot of it really critically, helpfully so, tells me we've got more people looking at us than ever before. Why are they doing it? It's not because they're angry at us, as some would have you believe. It's because they value what we do. They want it to be even better. Their standards are pushing us higher. To me, that's the value of social media. And that's the value of citizen journalism. To the extent that every sentence that we write gets looked at more closely by more people who have more means to reach us and call us out. Some people find that uncomfortable. I think I did when it started. Now I think it's one of the best parts of my job. The din that comes at our every move helps improve our work. Doesn't hurt us. Might hurt our business model. Might be a challenge to our future in the traditional sense. But in the day by day, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. I think I feel more engaged every year by the readers. Used to be when you wrote things, they landed on silence. That doesn't happen anymore, even if you just write about taking your kids fishing. Someone calls you up and says, you know, I fished there, and you were in the wrong spot. Or I fished there, and why did you give that spot up? Because now next time I go, there's going to be 20 guys standing on that rock. That's a good thing. So I was asked also to say, what does it look like, this thing called the future for all of us? And I always fall back when I get asked that on the same line, that things are really hard to predict, especially the future. But I think the future looks a lot like now, in that we're blending. You know, we look at Finbar, who's in front of me right now. He's a writer and a photographer. I started out strictly as a writer. I'm not a photographer. I carry a camera, but to me it's more like a video machine, a Xerox machine with a little button on it. I don't really know how to use it, but I'm trying. I'm trying to use a video camera. I'm trying to use all these social media sites. As new social media sites come up, I'll probably dip my toe into each one, trying to figure out what they can do. I think we're blending. You know, we used to be much more narrow, and now we're picking up a whole other set of skills, not mastering them, you can't, but you're adding them to your toolkit, the way people once added a telephone to their desk. And I think that there will be more tools, more apps, more websites, smaller, better cameras. Night vision and GPS will soon be incorporated within the next few years, by my guess, into everything we carry and do. For someone like me who covers war, that's really valuable. Eventually it might even go thermal. But it's all just more information. And so the future looks like, I think, the present, in the sense that those of us who are trying to keep up with it will just keep adding things. And it's not an overburden. People might try to tell you it is. I don't think it is. I think we're getting better. I don't think we're getting worse. Might not know how to sell it, but I think the skill sets that we're developing are helping us gather and process more information in more ways and bring out richer reports than what we could 10 years ago. Now, the other thing I'd like to say, I'd like to go back to humility. And I say this privately a lot. I say it publicly sometimes, that receiving an award as a reporter is something not right about that. Because I stand before you as a representative of a big institution that makes my work possible. And everywhere I go, I have a photographer with me. Everywhere. Well, that's not true. Everywhere I go in the field, I have a photographer with me. I spend a lot of times in archives and going through my own material and notes and doing stuff alone that informs my work. But all of the actual collecting of the material in the dangerous environments, in the fluid environments, in the confusing environments, I always have a photographer with me. I often have a local translator with me who's a cultural and social and personal guide. And none of the things, except maybe the fishing story, that you heard about today flowed solely from my own experience. I was out there, it was the New York Times, trusted me to be out there, backed me when I made mistakes, counseled me when I needed counseling, offered friendship when I was feeling down. A lot of times it's the photographer who has the idea, let's go down this road, not that road. It's the photographer who sees something that I didn't see and points me to it. So to have your name on an award, to stand at a podium like this and not have it also say Tyler Hicks or Brian Denton or Joao Silva, and the list could go on. There's something about it that brings you back to that word humility. Someone's got to speak. There's only one microphone. Tonight's my turn. But this is really about the entire industry. It's not just about me. Now, having said that, I'll also add that I'm not especially interesting. So I'd like to switch over to taking questions, because I think your questions will be a lot more interesting than more talk from me.